Hello, everybody. It's Mrs. Pound, and we are starting a new chapter, Chapter 3, Introduction to Cells. And this is from BJU Biology's 4th edition. So, the first thing we want to talk about is Section 3A, the structure of cells. So, our objectives for today's video are to outline the events that led to the development of the cell theory, state the cell theory, differentiate between unicellular and multicellular organisms, and distinguish between colonial organisms and organisms containing organ systems. So the first thing I want to talk about is section 3.1, cell theory. So what we are going to be studying is actually called cytology. Cytology is the study of cells. And cytology began in 1665 with Robert Hooke. Using a microscope that he developed, he was the first to identify cork cells, and I put that in quote because they actually were not cells. They were no longer living. What he actually saw were cell walls of the dead cork cells, but he called them cells because they looked like the little rooms that monks live in, which were called cells. Now, there was a long gap while microscopes were improved until Robert Brown in 1833 described the nucleus of a cell. And he really studied the nucleus and discovered many of the things that we know about the nucleus today. Then there was Matthias Schleiden in 1838. He stated that all plants are composed of cells. That's what he discovered. He was a botanist. And Theodor Schwann in 1855 discovered that all animals are composed of cells. And here in the background, you see some blood cells. And then Rudolf Virchow, 1855, discovered that cells arise only from pre-existing cells. So the discoveries of all of these individuals were combined into what we call the cell theory. And the cell theory states that cells are the basic units that make up all living things, that cells come from pre-existing cells, and that cells carry on the functions of all living things. So those are the three important parts of the cell theory. Now, another thing we need to realize is that cells can only be a certain size, and it has to do with the ratio of a cell's surface area to its volume is the factor that limits the size of a cell, because cells have to absorb materials, they have to move them around, so they have to be relatively small and have a certain surface area to volume ratio in order to be functional. Now, some of those cellular functions and processes that go on in a cell are nutrition, first of all. Part of nutrition is absorption, the transport of dissolved substances into cells to serve as building blocks or energy sources. Digestion, the enzymatic breakdown of substances to obtain building materials or energy. And then there are some internal functions. These are synthesis, the assembly of organic compounds from smaller units. Respiration, the breakdown of food with the release of energy. Movement, which includes both locomotion, moving from place to place, and internal movement inside of the cell. Irritability, response of the cell to its environment. Now, some of these terms you might see are familiar because we've talked about them. They're the characteristics of living things. There's also the release of materials from cells. There's excretion, the removal of soluble waste from the cell. Egestion, the elimination of insoluble waste from the cell. Secretion, the synthesis and release of substances from the cell. And then there's continuation of existence. There's homeostasis, the ability to maintain a steady state in the cell, and reproduction, the formation of new cells. So those are many of the processes and functions of cells. Now, one last thing I want to talk about, because it's just a quick topic here, are the levels of cellular organization. So we have the cell theory that all things are made of cells, but there are different levels to this. First of all, we have unicellular organisms. These are your organisms that are composed of just one cell. Things like bacteria, protists are just one cell. There are also colonial organisms. These are a collection of similar cells living together, each cell being capable of carrying on life processes independently and of forming another colony. In the background here, I actually have slime mold, and slime mold is a type of fungus. And it can live individually on its own. It actually forms a colony to reproduce and send out fruiting bodies, but it spends part of its life process just living on its own, and then it can colonialize. There are also multicellular organisms. These are organisms made of many cells, like us. We contain tissues. A tissue is a group of similar cells that work together to carry out a specific function. These cells normally depend on other tissues to supply some of their metabolic needs. So, unlike colonies, tissues are dependent upon one another. They cannot be independent like a colony. Tissues also form organs. Organs are several types of tissues working together to perform a specific function. In the background here, these are cow kidneys. They're beef kidneys. So that's what their kidneys look like. And then organs can form organ systems. This is a group of organs that work together to accomplish life functions. So in the background here, you can actually see many different organ systems. There's the digestive system, the circulatory system, the nervous system, are a few, the respiratory system are a few that you see there in the background, the excretory system. Okay. We have lots of systems that we'll talk about further later. So our objectives for this video were to outline the events that led to the development of the cell theory, state the cell theory, differentiate between unicellular and multicellular organisms, and distinguish between colonial organisms and organisms containing organ systems. So don't forget your 5 questions in the margin and continue watching to answer the questions at the end of the video.